Hare Krishna, dear devotees, and welcome to today's session. How are you doing? I pray that all is well with you and your families at this time. So today we're on day number 8 of the Purushotam Maas challenge, and we're also moving on to the next verse in this 15th chapter. I also hope and pray that everything is going well with your vrat and that you are managing it through. We've just completed 1 week and we just have 3 weeks to go. So today we're moving on to the next verse, which is in the next theme of this chapter. The first theme was the banyan tree, the upside down banyan tree. And in this theme, Krishna is telling us about the spiritual world and how the soul makes his journey back there. So today's verse is as follows. Mam evam sa jiva loke jiva bhutha sanatanaha manashashtani indriyani prakritishtani karshati. Translation: the living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. So we'll try to go over each part of the translation together. Prabhupada's translation. The living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. I think this part, actually this verse is divided into 2 parts. One, establishing how the soul is eternally part and parcel. We always use this verse. This is the main pramana, the main evidence against the Mayavadi idea that the soul merges into the Supreme when it attains liberation or perfection. It never merges. This verse describes how they are eternally parts and parcels. They are eternally. It's never a time when they merge. So there are 3 main verses to defeat this Mayavad philosophy. This is the first one, where clearly Krishna is saying they are eternally. It's not that they are in the material world, they are separated, and then in the spiritual world they merge. No, the word is eternal. Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. Sanatana means eternally. So they are eternally parts and parcels. The second evidence for this is chapter 2, verse number 23. Nayanan chindanti shastani nayanan dahati pavaka na chainan kledayantapo na sosyati marutaha. So in that verse, Krishna is describing that there are different things that you may think that can affect the soul. No, nothing can affect the soul in this world. The soul, nayanan chindanti shashtani, it cannot be cut, cleaved. It cannot be withered by the weather. It cannot be wet. It cannot be burnt by fire. So the first one, it cannot be cut into parts. Nayanan chindanti shashtani, it cannot be cut. So if it cannot be cut, then how did it separate from the Supreme Being? Because if the Mayavad philosophy is correct, that means that we are all God, and then we have separated from God, and now we are in a conditioned state. And now from that conditioned state, when we get perfection, liberation, we go back to the spiritual world, then we merge again. That means we were cut. We were cut from God, then we separated, then we merge back. But here the philosophy is saying, Nayanan chindanti shastani, it cannot be cut. So it defeats second point that defeats Mayavad philosophy. And the third point comes in this chapter, but in the 16th verse. So we'll cover it in more detail when we get to it, but we'll just mention that there Krishna talks about 2 different souls, kind of souls. One is Shara and other one is Akshara. Perishable or fallible and infallible. So he describes these 2, one which is conditioned and the other one which is liberated. And then the third element he describes is the supreme living being. So that means there are these two souls which are there, and then there's a supreme being. It doesn't describe that they merge. He gives the answer that there are three states of being. One is the perfected state, the eternally souls, the eternally liberated souls, and the other one is the conditioned souls where we are. And then he says, of that two, then there's also a third element, which is the supreme living being, God. So he doesn't describe that they merge. He describes that there are three states of being. So we can see with this evidence, 1, 2, and 3 evidence that I've given you now, this verse, then the verse 2.23, and then the verse 15.16, these three verses completely smash Mayavad philosophy, that we merge into God. So Prabhupada goes on to say here, due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. So due to this conditioned state of being, they are struggling. Because the question may come, we have this world and we know it's all entangled like the banyan tree we saw. And then we have the spiritual world that we're hearing about, we heard about yesterday. Na tad bhashite suryo nasasankava na pavaka yatkatvam na nivartante tad dhamam paramam mama. Yesterday's verse where Krishna is saying, that place, that spiritual world, you go there, you don't come back here. So how did the soul end up here? So first part we're hearing about how the soul is part of God, but how did he end up here? The struggle that he's having, and how does he go back? That's the second part of the verse. So it's because of the senses. So how many senses we have? 6 senses. This verse describes we have 6 senses. We have 5 gross senses, and then we have the subtle sense, which is the mind. So the mind is the sense that controls the 6 gross senses. So in total we have 6 senses. And it's because of the mind being pulled this way and that way, therefore we are struggling for existence. So Prabhupada starts the purport. He says here, in this verse, the identity of the living being is clearly given. The living entity is the fragmental part and parcel of the Supreme Lord eternally. So this word part and parcel, it's an old English saying to say that you belong to, it's connected to, part and parcel. So Prabhupada would use this a lot, part and parcel, when describing the soul's connection to the Supreme Lord. So Prabhupada again is making this point that eternally, sanatana. It's not that they are separated at some time, then they're in the conditioned state and then they go back. No, they are sanatana. And 15.16 describes akshara, shara and akshara, where there's conditioned souls, there's liberated souls, and then there's the Supreme Being. So it's not that they ever merge. Prabhupada goes on to say, it is not that he assumes individuality in his conditional life and in his liberated state becomes one with the Supreme Lord. He is eternally fragmented. It is clearly said, sanatanaha. So this is the same point Prabhupada is making. So we go on. According to the Vedic version, the Supreme Lord manifests and expands himself in innumerable expansions, of which the primary expansion are called Vishnu Tattva and the secondary expansion are called the living entities. In other words, the Vishnu Tattva is the personal expansion and the living entities are the separated expansion. So 2 types of part and parcels. One is the Vishnu Tattva and the other one is the living entities. So even Vishnu Tattva, Vishnu is part and parcel of Krishna. Usually when we hear of part and parcel, we think of just the living entities, the souls. No, this is also part and parcel. Swamsa and Vibhinansa. Prabhupada describes this. By his personal expansion, he is manifested in many forms like Lord Rama, Narasimhadev, Vishnu Murti, and all the predominating deities in the Vaikuntha planets. The separated expansions, the living entities, are eternal servitors. The personal expansions of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the individual identities of the Godhead, are always present. Similarly, the separated expansions of the living entities have their identities as fragmental parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord. The living entities also have fragmental portions of His qualities, of which independence is one. So Prabhupada is elaborating on this point that everything in creation is part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, but He is the separated Supreme Being. And if you think about it, there cannot be an idea of devotion or devotional service if we are to merge. You have to have two to experience love. How can you love yourself? You have to have two to experience love and to do devotional service. Prabhupada goes on to say, every living entity as an individual soul has his personal individuality and a minute form of independence. So the only thing we have is this independence. And this independence, by our free will, we can thus choose to serve Krishna or not. If we serve Krishna, we become one of those liberated souls that stay in the spiritual world. And if we don't, we want to go against Krishna, we don't want to serve Krishna, then we become one of the souls that end up in the conditioned world, the material world, in the conditioned state. By misuse of that independence, one becomes a conditioned soul. And by proper use of that independence, he is always liberated. So Prabhupada is just reiterating what I just said now. In either case, he is qualitatively eternal as the Supreme Lord is. In his liberated state, he is freed from this material condition, and he is under the engagement of transcendental service unto the Lord. In his conditioned life, he is dominated by the material modes of nature, and he forgets the transcendental loving service of the Lord. So it's a matter of independence. What is your choice? We were saying that we also have that. That is the only thing we actually possess. Because we come into this world with nothing and we go out with nothing. So what do we possess? This independence, the free will of choice. To serve Krishna with love, or to serve our senses here and suffer, as the verse is saying. We are serving the senses. Manashastani indriyani prakritishtani karshati. We suffer here under using the senses just to serve ourselves. But that same facility served to Krishna, using that same senses to serve Krishna, we can become liberated and go back to the spiritual world. As a result, he has to struggle very hard to maintain his existence in the material world. The living entities, not only human beings and cats and dogs, but even the greater controllers of the material world, Brahma, Lord Shiva, and even Vishnu, are all parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord. So it was very nice to see this, that Prabhupada is describing even Vishnu is part and parcel of Krishna. Prabhupada goes on to say, they are all eternal, not temporary manifestations. The word karshati, struggling or grappling hard, is very significant. The conditioned soul is bound up. So now we're hearing why is he struggling. Let's see what Prabhupada says. The conditioned soul is bound up as though shackled by irons. He is bound up by the false ego, and the mind is the chief agent which is driving him in this material existence. So why is he bound up? Because of the false ego. And what is the false ego working through? It's working through the mind. Therefore, if you're able to control the mind through mantra, if you're able to control the mind through chanting, gradually reduce the false ego to its true ego, servant of Krishna. Prabhupada goes on to say, when the mind is in the mode of goodness, his activities are good. when the mind is in the mode of passion, his activities are troublesome. And when the mind is in the mode of ignorance, he travels in the lower species of life. It is clear, however, in this verse that the conditioned soul is covered by the material body, which the mind and the senses, and when he is liberated, this material covering perishes. But this spiritual body manifests itself in its individual capacity. That means the spiritual body is always there, but it's covered over at the moment by this material body. What is this material body? Bhumyapo nalavayu kamano buddhirevacha ahamkar vimudatma bhinnam prakriti ashtara. It's made of these 5 elements and the mind, intelligence and false ego. This is the subtle body. Gross body, 5 elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether. Subtle body, mind, intelligence, false ego. Spiritual body, Satchitananda, Vigraha. Prabhupada goes on to say, the following information is there in the Mandhyandina Yana Shruti. Sava esa brahmanista idam sariram martyam attishra brahma bhishmam Padya brahmana pashyanti brahmana shruti brahmana vedam sarvam anubhavati. It is stated here that where a living entity gives up this material embodiment and enters into the spiritual world, he revives his spiritual body, and in his spiritual body he can see the Supreme Personality of Godhead face to face. He can hear and speak to him face to face, and he can understand the Supreme Personality as he is. From Smriti also it is understood, Vasanti yatra Purushaha sarve vaikunte murtyaha. So we can see that when you reach this perfected state, you can speak to the Lord face to face. I think it's even described in the Quran, in the Islamic tradition in the Quran, that Prophet Muhammad went to the spiritual world and saw Allah face to face. So this is the same description that's also given here. Prabhupada goes on to say, in the spiritual planets, everyone lives in bodies featured like the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So everybody has this Vishnu feature there. That's why when you look at them, you won't know who's Vishnu and who's not. That may be why one of the misunderstandings, why they think everybody is one, they all is God. That you merge with God, because everybody looks the same there. The Vishnu feature is only different with the Kasturba gem on his chest and the Srivatsa hair on his chest. Otherwise, everybody looks the similar there. Prabhupada goes on to say, as far as bodily construction is concerned, there is no difference between the part and the parcel living entities and the expansions of Vishnu Murti. In other words, at liberation, the living entity gets a spiritual body by the grace of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So spiritually, there is no difference. Their bodies are identical, spiritually. But of course, Krishna is the Supreme Being. So he definitely is Purna, full. So qualitatively we are one with God, but quantitatively huge difference. Krishna is the Nitya Nityanam Chaitanas Chaitananam Eko Bahunam Jo Vitadadi Kaman. Both are eternal, Nitya, and both are conscious, Chaitana. But Eko Bahunam Jo Vidadadi Kaman. One is maintaining the other. So you can see there is a difference. So Prabhupada goes on to say, the words Mame Vamsa, fragmental parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord, are very significant. The fragmental portion of the Supreme Lord is not like some material broken part. We have already understood in the 2nd chapter that the spirit cannot be cut into pieces. This fragments is not materially conceived. It is not like matter, which can be cut into pieces and joined together again. So this is where we get the evidence from the second chapter 2.23 that I just quoted to you, that if the soul cannot be cut into pieces, then how did it separate from that one Supreme Lord? It cannot be cut. So Prabhupada goes on to say, that conception is not applicable here because the Sanskrit word Sanatana, eternal. The Lord is eternal, soul is eternal. He cannot be cut. Prabhupada goes on to say, is used. The fragmental portion is eternal. It is also stated in the beginning of the second chapter that in each and every individual body, the fragmental portion of the Supreme Lord is present. Dehinosmin yata dehe. That fragmental portion, when liberated from the bodily entanglement, revives his original spiritual body in the spiritual sky, in a spiritual planet, and enjoys association with the Supreme Lord. It is, however, understood here that the living entities, being the fragmental part and parcels of the Supreme Lord, is qualitatively one with the Lord, just as the part and parcels of gold are also gold. So we see we've covered this very strongly, very thoroughly, but there's, of course, Gita is unlimited, so we can get unlimited realizations through analyzing this. But this is the seed verse that shows why the living entity left the spiritual world, how they're struggling here, and how we can go back. So in our attempt to see the journey of the soul transmigrating and going back to the spiritual world. So I hope you enjoyed today's class today. Please think about these points carefully, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Hare Krishna.